Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So in this video, we'll be talking about fraud, the different types of fraud, as well as the responsibility for the detection and prevention of fraud within an audit. Now, before I go any further, just a couple of things to note. One of the most important is when we, at the end of the audit, provide our audit opinion or our audit conclusion, we are providing an audit opinion or conclusion about whether the financial report is free from material, which means significant, misstatement, which is a situation where the information is indeed wrong, incorrect, or omitted. We're providing a conclusion about whether the financial report is free from significant issues, whether due to, here we go, fraud or error. Okay? So when you think about that, when you think about the fact that we're providing a conclusion about whether the financial report is free from significant issues, whether due to fraud or error, it naturally leads us to the next question. And that is, well, what's the difference between fraud and error? Now, I have addressed this in another video, but I'm just going to remind you about the distinction here. And the distinction comes down to intention. Okay, it comes down to whether that error, that misstatement, was indeed intentional or not. Now, how do you make that link? Well, an intentional misstatement is called a fraud. So that's when management, for example, is intentionally manipulating the numbers so they can get their bonuses, for example. Error, on the other hand, is unintentional. Error is like a mistake. For example, the accountant has gone to debit cash for $100, but has accidentally added an extra zero. The key word being accidentally. So when we talk about the distinction between fraud and error, it comes down to the intention behind the act. Fraud is an intentional act, whereby error is an unintentional mistake. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on fraud. Now, for your reference, the standard that you need to refer to when it comes to fraud, and I'll write that down here for you, is ASA, so Auditing Standard 240. Okay, so it's really important that you refer to this standard as it will give you the information you need on fraud. So let's get into this in further detail. So as I mentioned earlier, the auditing standard that covers fraud is indeed ASA 240, and it's paragraph 11 of ASA 240 that goes on to provide the definition of fraud. So it goes on to say that fraud is an intentional act. Now remember, we noted that word. It's an intentional act. Let's keep reading. By one or more individuals among management, those charged with governance, employees, or third parties, involving the use of deception to obtain an unjust or illegal advantage. So again, using deception, that goes hand in hand with the fact that it is indeed an intentional act, and it is being undertaken in order to obtain an unjust or illegal advantage. For example, manipulating sales to make it look like they hit their sales targets so management can get their bonuses. So that's one type of fraud. So that leads us to, well, how many different types of fraud are there? There are two. We have two different types of fraud. The first one is called fraudulent financial reporting, and the second is called misappropriation of assets. Now, it's very important for you to know these terms. So let me explain what each one means. With the first type of fraud, which is fraudulent financial reporting, quite simply, the easiest way for me to explain this one to you is fraudulent financial reporting refers to when management or personnel committing fraud are manipulating the numbers. So it's the intentional misstatement or omission of amounts or disclosures with the intent to deceive users. It's the manipulation of the information. Now that's different to the second type of fraud, which is called misappropriation of assets. Misappropriation of assets quite simply refers to theft. theft of the entity's assets. Now that can refer to, for example, stealing cash from the cash register. It can include stealing inventory from the shelves or the warehouse. It can also include stealing information about the company as well. So they are the two different types of fraud. So we have number one, fraudulent financial reporting, which is the manipulation of the information. And number two is misappropriation of assets, which is essentially theft. To provide you some more examples of these two different types of fraud, with the first one, fraudulent financial reporting, it includes examples like, as I said earlier, manipulation of the records, falsification, so including fake sales, or altering the records of a company. It can also include omitting information, omitting the effects of certain transactions on records or documents. It can include recording transactions without substance, so they're not real or they don't have the appropriate documentation to support them. And also intentionally applying accounting policies. So a good example of this one, and I'll do a little arrow for you. A good example of this one is, for example, using a different depreciation method than you're supposed to because it results in better information, or misapplying that method is probably a better way of thinking about it. So it's intentional misapplication of accounting policies. Actually, a better example of that one would be manipulating the way that sales are recognized. So instead of waiting until a good is delivered to a customer in order to recognize that sale, recognizing the sale straight away when we receive the order. Okay, so it's misapplication of accounting policies is another example. Now, the misappropriation of assets, so the second type of fraud, this one here, involves things such as embezzling receipts, stealing assets, which is probably the main one, or using an entity's assets for personal use. So these are just some examples to give you a better understanding of the two different types of fraud, which are fraudulent financial reporting and misappropriation of assets. This brings us to an incredibly important slide. So I'm just going to do a little star here. This is a very, very important slide and a very important concept. And the concept is the fraud triangle. Now, what is the fraud triangle? The fraud triangle comes down to the fact that typically, so generally, for there to be fraud, there needs to be three things. 1, 2, 3. Now, the first one is, in order for there to be fraud, there needs to be some form of incentive or pressure for the person to have committed the fraud. The second thing is there must be, at some point, an opportunity for that fraud to be committed. And thirdly, there was some form of attitude or justification for why the person committed the fraud in the first place. So this one's about attempting to justify the fraud in their mind. So in summary, in order for a fraud to take place, there needs to be some form of incentive or pressure to commit the fraud, an opportunity to commit the fraud, and some form of justification for that action. So let's go through each one. I'll do this one in yellow. Okay. So the first one is there needs to be some form of incentive or pressure. Now let me give you some examples of these ones here. For example, an incentive could be to commit fraud, could be if sales are linked to bonuses. So management or sales personnel may manipulate their sales records to meet their targets and to get their bonus. So that would be an incentive to actually commit fraud in order to get their bonuses. And this is probably one of the biggest incentives we see for management committing fraud in the first place. Another incentive could be someone in the business, they really like designer shoes, they really like designer handbags, or they really like designer cars or luxury cars, I should say. So that might be an incentive for them to commit fraud and, for example, embezzle money from their company so they're able to afford the designer shoes or handbags or luxury cars that they wanted. An example of a pressure could be someone working in the business. They may have a sick child at home, and their sick child needs medical treatment that's quite expensive. So in that case, that might be a pressure on that person to commit fraud, potentially steal money from the organisation in order to cover those expensive medical treatments that their child needs. So that would be a pressure. Something else that you could think of is the person is experiencing personal financial difficulty. So it could be because they have a gambling addiction or a drug addiction or something like that. I know that's a bit extreme, but that could also be a pressure. So the very first section, or the first component that you would often have present in a situation where fraud is carried out is there was some incentive for them to commit fraud, or there was a pressure for them to commit the fraud. If we move on to the second component, which is an opportunity, well, in order for someone to commit fraud, they had to have an opportunity to commit the fraud. So that could be because there was a lack of internal controls and checks within the business. So someone at the cash register, they know that no one's going to check the amount of money in the cash register, then they have an opportunity to steal that money, for example, right? So it could also be, if you want to think about it more from a system perspective, anyone has access to the accounting system, which means that they can simply log on and manipulate information within that system. So there's an opportunity for them to access the system and change the information or change the numbers. That's opportunity as well. So you'd have some form of incentive or pressure, but if you have an incentive or pressure, if you don't have an opportunity to actually commit the fraud, then it's not going to happen. So you need an incentive or a pressure, but you also need an opportunity to commit the fraud as well. The third component is rationalization or attitude. This one's all about an attempt by the person committing the fraud, the attempt to justify the fraud in the mind of the person committing the fraud. For example, I work so hard and I get such a low salary. It's not okay. I deserve more. I deserve this extra money and I'm just going to take it, right? So this is the attitude or attempt to justify why the fraud is okay and committing the fraud is okay in the mind of the person committing the fraud, right? So I often provide, I bring this particular fraud triangle up to classes, and I say, okay, let's talk about this, but let's talk about it in the context of something that's a bit more relatable to students. So as we all know, just up the road we have a Woolworths. So let's think about the self-checkout system at Woolworths. You know how you can scan your own products. So what could be an example of the incentive or pressure, the opportunity and the attitude or rationalization that comes about for someone who, and I'll write this down. So let's say that they want to commit fraud at Woolworths checkout. So Woolworths checkout. That's our scenario. So checkout machines. Okay. So in that case, well, if you think about it in terms of the incentive or the pressure, well, someone might commit fraud when it comes to checking out, doing their self-checkout at Woolworths because they don't have the money, right? So they get to the checkout, they don't have the money, and therefore they just steal the inventory. They just steal the things that they wanted to buy because they don't have the money to buy it, okay? So that could be the pressure. The opportunity, well, with the self-checkout systems, there's very minimal supervision, right? So there's an opportunity to just walk out. Now, guys, please be mindful. I am not encouraging anyone to actually take anything from Woolworths without paying for it. That's morally wrong. But we're just providing that as an example here. So the pressure could be they just don't have the money. The opportunity comes about because those self-checkout machines are not really supervised as much as they could. And what could be the justification? The justification could be, well, Woolworths is a multi-billion-dollar business, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar company. They can afford it. So if I don't make this $5 or $10 or $15 payment, it's not really going to affect them very much. So this scenario shows you how in a situation such as this one, where fraud is committed, remember stealing is a type of fraud, it's called misappropriation of assets, that comes about because of some incentive or pressure to commit the fraud, an opportunity to commit the fraud, and an attempt to justify the fraud in the mind of the person committing the fraud. So typically, in order for a fraud to take place, you will see these three elements happen, or these three elements come through. So this brings us to a very important question. Who is responsible for detecting and preventing fraud? Is it the auditor? Is it management? Is it the board of directors? Who is it? Again, your reference is ASA 240, and in particular, I want to bring your attention to paragraph 4, because, and we have mentioned this in class previously as well, you need to remember something that's very important. The primary responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud, ladies and gentlemen, rests with those charged with governance of the entity and management, not the auditor. Remember the case we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, the Kingston Cotton Mill case. Remember, the auditor is a watchdog, not a bloodhound. What does that mean? It is not our job to go looking for fraud. Rather, we must be mindful, we must be alert, and we must look out for red flags. Now, remember what a red flag is. Red flag is anything that looks suspicious. So I'm just going to write that in, red flag. Or red flags, I should say. Oops, that's an S. Oh dear, that's an S. Okay, so it's not our job to go looking for fraud, but we must be alert for red flags, things that look suspicious, and we must investigate them accordingly. Okay, so what ASA 240 goes on to say is that we must specifically consider the risks of material misstatement that come from fraud. We must discuss the entity's susceptibility to fraud. We must make inquiries of management when it comes to fraud. And if we ever find fraud, we must report it to the appropriate level of management, regardless of amounts. Now, we've spoken about that before. Remember, material, the term materiality means significant or important. When we perform an audit, we are looking for material misstatements. Now, what can make a misstatement material? A misstatement, an issue, a problem can be material because of its amount, because of its dollar amount. It can also be material because of its nature. And ladies and gentlemen, fraud is significant because of its nature, right? If I'm a shareholder of a company and I find out that someone in that company committed fraud, my focus wouldn't be on how much it was the fact that they committed fraud. So even if it was for $50, that doesn't matter, it was fraud. So it's significant, it's material because of its nature. Okay, and that's why we've got this reference to regardless of amount. So if we find fraud, we need to report it to the right people, regardless of how much it related to. So to come back and remind you once more time about our responsibility as the auditor, it is not our responsibility to go looking for fraud, but we must be alert for red flags and we must investigate them accordingly. Remember, the auditor is a watchdog, not a bloodhound. Okay, and the final thing I'll mention here before we go to the next slide is you must refer to ASA 240, and more specifically, you must refer to the appendix of ASA 240. If you go to the appendix of that particular standard, you will see a massive list of potential red flags. Okay, things that would if they came up in an audit, things that the auditor should become very alert to and should investigate accordingly. So it's quite a long list of things to look at. So please make sure you refer to the appendix of ASA 240 because it's going to give you a better understanding of the things that we have to be really alert about, and the things that would highlight something that seems suspicious, and will highlight areas that we should look into and investigate further. So in conclusion, when we conduct the audit, we as the auditor, we must exercise reasonable care and reasonable skill, and we must maintain an attitude of professional skepticism. Remember, professional skepticism means we need to have a questioning mind. We need to be alert to red flags. We need to investigate them accordingly. Okay, we need to collect sufficient evidence to corroborate claims made by the client. I mentioned this in class, and I mentioned this in a previous video as well. We can't just take the client's word. We can't just believe everything that they tell us. We must corroborate those claims by getting supporting documentation as evidence to support or to back up the claims that are being made by management or the client. Remember, the auditor should not assume that management is dishonest, but the possibility of dishonesty must be considered. Okay, so we're not saying that management and the client are lying to you, but the fact that they can potentially lie to you means that you have to be even more alert, and you can't just take their word for it. You must corroborate or get evidence to support things that the client is telling you. Again, this is such an important quote. I keep repeating it. The auditor is a watchdog, not a bloodhound. It's not our job to go looking for fraud, but we must be alert to red flags. Okay, so it's really important that you understand what fraud is. It's very important to understand the different types of fraud and what our responsibility is when it comes to fraud. Well done on making it through another video. Good job, guys. Tick for effort. If you do have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll see you in class.